Hello and welcome to the 12 Great Men podcast. Okay, we've made it past the Tar Palantir episode. Just to get one thing out of the way, apparently I've accrued quite the reputation for being something of a hater towards Pharazon, because I consider him a very bad man not worth emulating, which, needless to say, is the source of remarkable amusement to me. To be quite honest, of all the villains Tolkien ever wrote, our Pharazon ranks as one of my favorites. What can I say? I like how unashamedly vile he is. He rises so high due to pride and falls so far and so low. I like his story, and I actually consider him in some ways more interesting than even Sauron, another favorite of mine. So now that we've got that out of the way, it's time to start recounting the tale. When Tar Palantir died, he left quite the mess. The kingdom was in shambles. The military and nobility had revolted. The people were tired of his goody-two-shoes policies. They wanted out on his goodness, and were keen to see the nation pivot towards evil, so that they were not keen on having Tar Miriel as Queen Lena. Now, to understand Pharazon and the complex nature of his character, one must understand that he was born the son of Gimmelcad, which would mess up just about anyone. Raised believing he was the rightful heir, his uncle was something of an usurper, as he was leading Numenor down the wrong path. He came to resent and dislike the old man. This was not to say that he was trained, so to speak, to hate the faithful. To the contrary, early in life he became close friends with Amandil, who came from the longest serving line of faithful, and also the Distaff royal line. The trouble was that Amandil was a little interested in bucking his forebears' lessons, and was at his core weak-willed and had a self-serving side to his character. It was for this reason that Amandil was easily charmed by the other nobleman, who was to see quite a bit of active military and naval service alongside Amandil. A hero to the army and navy, Pharazon combined personal courage with military brilliance, and another quality Tar Palantir did not have, an acute political acumen. Pharazon was to bribe and send continuous donations to many of the people of Numenor, effectively seducing them with his wealth. A tactic that has worked the world over. If you can't charm the people into stupidity or evil, or overthrowing their government, just bribe them. Pharazon was thus to, when he came to the throne, have the support of everybody. It is thus a wonder that he lost the support of the Elendili. The source of his problems was to prove to be Elendil, the son of Amandil. The heir of the Undunier was not the sort to care for bending his neck to a man guilty of incest, of violating the rightful queen, or for the sort of high-handed ways that Pharazon had in mind for the people of Numenor. That aside, Pharazon's first act as king was to force a new name upon his cousin, shunning her beloved birth name, which had been a Quendi name, and humiliating her still further, so that she was in this way forced to become complicit to his reign. Turning now upon the nobility that might have had mixed feelings about turning upon the Valar, he outlawed the Elendili and stepped up his abuse towards them. Come on, we'd all do that in his shoes. Amandil, meanwhile, caught in this trap, submitted and retained his rank and influence at court, never risking it for his friends, to the outrage of his kindred. Pharazon might have been content with this sort of life, but across the sea, Sauron had shown him up in terms of titles, calling himself King of Kings and King of Arda, and other such titles. Sauron, in this way, proclaimed himself overlord of all, and the big banana. His pride pricked by this act on the part of the Lord of Mordor, especially the big banana title. No one could have that except for Pharazon. Pharazon swore not to tolerate this insult. If anyone the insult was directed against, it was the Númenóreans in Middle-earth, or at least upon the continent of Middle-earth, and the likes of Gil-galad. However, be that as it may, Pharazon did what had not been accomplished since the days of Tar Atanamir. He gathered together the greatest naval and military force that had ever been seen since the days of Morgoth in the First Age. This army was so terrifying that at the sight of it, Sauron took fright and did what any reasonable leader might do. He surrendered. Sure, he might have been able to win, but not without great losses on his side, so that his decision was a natural one. Kneeling before the king of Numenor, Sauron humbled himself, paying homage and surrendering his scepter to the king, as though he were a defaulting vassal. Needless to say, Pharazon was charmed and inordinately pleased by the submission. His ego, already a considerable size, must have only grown all the more puffed up at the knowledge that Sauron, a Maiar, one of the blessed folk of the lands of Aman, brought into existence directly by Eru Ilúvatar, had just knelt before him. Warned against taking Sauron with him by the elves, Pharazon, ever spiteful towards them and keen to parade his new prisoner in the capital city of Armenelos, ignored this counsel. For Sauron, the whole experience was simply part of a ploy. That said, he was amazed when he first reached the star-shaped island of Numenor, and how could he not be? When last he had heard of them, the Númenóreans were a truly formidable force and people, who had depended as much upon the elves as vice versa in the time of Tar Minastir. Since that time, they had built the greatest city ever seen in history, had created such cities and gathered such wealth as to make them appear as gods to the men and women in Middle-earth. His wonder, though, was soon replaced with hatred and envy. Sauron hid his intentions well, though. Sucking up to Pharazon, he soon took to giving him counsel and whispering into his ears of the jealousy of the Valar. At first, he was simply a friend and confidant. In time, he became a counselor, then chief minister, and then, in time, bro, or I should say chief bro, and then, in time, high priest of Morgoth. The last promotion was one that came in time after many years of service to Pharazon, who had become emotionally and mentally dependent to an extent upon his prisoner, so that one must question who was truly the captor and who the captive. Regardless, Sauron told Pharazon that Eru was a lie, that the Valar were deceivers and not to be trusted, and that the OG god was Melkor. Crazy, right? Yet this trick somehow worked on the foolish people of Numenor and their mad king, so that they began to heap a great deal of sacrifices to the dark god of Angman, with Sauron acting as his mouthpiece, so that in this way the people indirectly worshiped the Lord of the Rings. Increasingly afraid of death the older he got, and less fond of the elves, whom he was jealous of, Pharazon in time came to persecute the Elendili. The culminating moment that saw the authority of Sauron cemented over the kingdom, though, was his ordering the cutting down of the White Tree. It had been predicted by Tar Palantir that so long as it stood, Numenor would stand, but that when the tree fell, so too would the kingdom. The heir of Elendil, Isildur, was to slip over and then slip back home with the seed of the White Tree. The tree was duly cut down, and thus Numenor had at last sealed its fate. It took some more time, but the maddened Númenóreans were to now descend to human sacrifices. Yes, you heard correctly. They took to sacrificing in the name of Sauron and Morgoth the Elendili, or at least those accused of being Elendili. The depravity and wickedness of Numenor had thus reached its summit, knowing no bounds. For Pharazon, these acts were the culmination of a long career, one that had seen him swept from the position of disgraced nephew of the king to the throne, and to the position of half-god in the eyes of his people. It was at this time that Sauron delivered the coup de grace, when he encouraged Pharazon to turn his gaze westwards to Valinor. Fed ideas about how the Valar lied about the Undying Lands, granting immortality, basically said, that's an advertising gimmick, and the mentally ill king believed him and ordered the armament of a great navy, one that made his previous one look like, well, nothing. A new one that was by far more glorious and powerful than anything ever previously seen in the history of the Second Age. This great fleet ready, and being extremely old, on the cusp of death, our Pharazon set out for the west. This was to be his last voyage. As he set out for the lands of the Undying, he was unaware that his old former friend, Amandil, had at last found himself a spine. For Amandil, he had clung to Pharazon as much out of sentimentality as out of loyalty, so that when he at last shook it off and began the journey west to warn the Valar of the attack that was to come, he left Numenor in some ways a broken man, leaving ahead of the fleet. He was one who had loved Pharazon in his own way, as might a brother, and who arrived to warn the Valar, if brokenly. He was prepared to suffer his punishment with a humility that Pharazon never could have mustered. In this way, Amandil had redeemed himself. As to Pharazon, he reached the shores of Aman. There was still some good left in him, though, so that it caused him to hesitate. Should he step on land? Should he truly do this? This was sacrilege. Should he press his foot upon the beaches that were supposed to be denied to all men? As always, though, what good there was in Pharazon was suppressed, and he made, as always, the wrong choice. He trod his way along with that of his men, upon the undying lands, little knowing that with this act he had delivered the last of the great insults against the Valar and Eru-Ilúvatar. Howling and whistling came the wind, more terrible than anything any of them had ever known. The seas rose up, the land twisted, and the mountains rose overhead and came tumbling down upon those beneath them. It happened now that Eru-Ilúvatar delivered his wrath, which took the form of a great tsunami that smashed the navy to pieces, trapped our Pharazon under rock and mountain, and that came to sweep up the lands of the Star Isle. The people of Númenor, at least those who had not in previous centuries, or had just recently fled with Elendil and his sons, were soon caught between their wicked misdeeds and the wrath of Ilúvatar. Some pleaded, others threatened him, and still others simply shouted and ran. It was all madness, with the tragic Queen Tarmiriel, so long denied anything other than sorrow and pain, was now to be delivered from her mortal sorrows when she fled up the mountain Meneltarma. It was there upon the peak of the mountain she met her end at the hands, so to speak, of the god her beloved father had so adored. Thus did the oceans drink up Númenor, devouring all that it had once been and leaving little of its splendor intact. All this due to the madness of one man and the wickedness of his favorite. For Sauron, the story is not over, for he fled over the seas with his one ring to rule them all. A shadow who was to rapidly reconstitute himself, if in uglier form than ever previously used by him. As to the legacy of Númenor, it was to continue on through Númenor's surviving royals in the shape of Elendil and his heirs. If you enjoyed this video and wish to see more, smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Eru-Ilúvatar destroying Númenor.